Welcome to the Blueprint Podcast, where we throw out the old blueprint so you can become who you were always meant to be. I'm your host, Jason Smith, and if you haven't already, make sure you click the subscribe button and share this podcast with your friends on social media and tag me in it at JBirdFit. Today, I have a very special guest for you, AK Dozanti. AK is a former deputy sheriff, speaker, coach, and author of Beat the Burnout, Prevention and Recovery Solutions for Frontline Professionals. After experiencing severe burnout in law enforcement, she made it her mission to help first responders manage stress, regulate their nervous system, and build sustainable careers. In this special 100th episode, we dive into her journey, the hidden toll of trauma in policing, and the real solutions for mental resilience. AK, welcome back to the Blueprint Podcast.
Congratulations on 100 episodes. That is phenomenal.
Thank you. I couldn't think of having a better guest on since you and I come from very similar backgrounds. Having served in law enforcement for 8 years myself, crime scene, SWAT team, and on a specialized unit. Obviously, first responders have a special place in my heart. And so it's always fun to be able to connect with people who are doing things in the space that are advancing things forward in mental health because it's so desperately needed. So what a wonderful way to do this. You and I had an episode, I think about a year and a half ago now. It was one of my earliest episodes of the podcast. So to see just how far both of us have come in our own process by simply believing in ourselves, by acknowledging that you can set a goal and actually attain that if you're consistent over long periods of time and disciplined in that process, even when everybody else is telling you, why are you doing that? You're crazy. That's stupid. You can't do that. What gives you the right to do that? And so you get hit with all this negativity, but you keep pushing forward. Now we've both hit this place where we've grown so much that you even have a book that is coming out.
I do.
Yeah. So tell everybody, since this might be the first time for a lot of people hearing you, who you are and who you help.
So I'm a former deputy sheriff. I had a really great career while it lasted. I was in for a few years. I started really young. I came onto the job with a bunch of unresolved things that I didn't know were things and trauma, basically. And I just immersed myself in the job. I was Officer of the Year in 2015, but before that year even ended, I was completely burned out. I was experiencing severe depression, adrenal fatigue, suicidal ideation, and I had to make a very difficult choice to leave full-time law enforcement. So at that point, I became a criminal court victim advocate, did that for a few years. While I was doing that, I was trying to heal myself, went back and got my master's degree, did a yoga teacher training, learned all kinds of things. And then in 2020, after I left that job, I took the totality of everything that I had learned and experienced and done and put it together and formed Lifesaver Wellness. So now I am a speaker, a coach, and a brand spanking new author to help first responders prevent and recover from burnout.
And we're definitely going to dive into that book, especially your writing process and what led up to that, because I want people that are out there that are listening, especially our first responders, that if they have a goal, if they have a dream, if they have a desire, that these things are attainable for you. But sometimes we just need to know what that first step is, or how you got interested, or the people that you connected with. And did you have a ghostwriter? And were there people that were helping you storyboard things out? And just what is that process? Now, the one thing that you mentioned in the very beginning there was onboarding to the job with trauma. And I think that goes unrecognized for a lot of individuals, because when you get into the job, there's usually a reason, right? You came from the military, and that's an easy transition into police work. Not easy. There's obviously some difficulties that come along with that because it's a difference in operating. But ultimately, it just makes sense that you would come from the military, you get into policing. Now, the other part of that is we also onboard with childhood trauma. And again, if these things are undiagnosed or unrecognized, it's going to end up popping up on the job at different places as you begin to experience things that, oh, that was my life. Oh, that was my experience. Oh, I've gone through that before. If we're saying that this is this, and this is actually a statute, and I experienced that as a child, and that was my normal, now all of a sudden you're like, your mind explodes and you start going through this process of discovering who you are on the job, and it's completely unrecognized.
I think that sometimes that's the experience, and sometimes there's, dare I say, a lack of self-awareness or emotional intelligence. And things start hitting you. You start getting these curveballs hitting you in the side of the head, and you're just like, I don't know why I'm feeling like this. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden irritable. I don't know why I don't want to be around anybody. And all I want to do is isolate and numb out and or drink or buy shiny things outside of my budget or do any of the name any
The shiny
maladaptive coping
things is
mechanism.
probably one
Yes.
of the favorites, yeah.
Yes. And sometimes there's just a lack of awareness of why these things are happening, why I'm changing, because you, maybe you've been so ingrained in that childhood experience that it was so normal for so long that you think that's not normal, or you just don't want to open that can of worms. So you can grow from it for sure, but there's also the other side of it where it might stunt you for a while if you're not willing to face it and you try to run away from it and numb it out.
What was it initially that drew you to the profession?
I don't know if I actually have a good answer for that. I've always had this really strong sense of justice,
Mhm.
just this sense of there's a right and there's a wrong. Growing up, I was not the bravest. I was a tomboy, and my best friend, who actually died by suicide when I was 17, she was very brave. Like, she was the kind that was, like, walking on the top of the monkey bars, like, just had this sense of courage that I just was always in awe of, and I always wanted to aspire to be that bold and that brave, and so I think when I got to an age where I wanted to take power over my own existence, I was like, "Oh, okay." And I really liked the justice system. I really loved the court system and how that all worked, and it just was a natural progression. I went to college undecided and started taking some classes, and then I did some shadow work with a small agency doing undercover online investigations, and that is where I got hooked. I did that as almost like an internship type thing, and I was immediately like, "How do I get in?
Right.
Give me the secret password. Tell me what steps I need to take. I want in." And they're like, "Well, you gotta go through the academy." And I was like, "Done. I'll do it
Right.
yesterday." So I was only 20 when I went through. I was the youngest. Like, you normally can't even go through the academy until you're 21. So I don't know if I have a solid answer, but it just felt natural, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was one of the oldest because I fell into this later in life. I started to believe in myself and went back to school in my 30s, got a bachelor's degree, got a master's degree, went to the police academy, did all of these things, got a really cool internship at HIDA. And like you, that's the high intensity drug trafficking area. And how interesting that was to partake in that and build out target profiles. And as you're going through this, you're just like, yeah, I want to do this. This is interesting. This is cool. And then you're hooked.
Yeah. And that was exactly what happened. They needed me as like a decoy. And so it I felt very valued in that role
Yeah.
because they were asking me for my insights as a young female and different things. It just really propelled me into law enforcement.
It's awesome. Now, your book is on burnout. And what point did you realize that's what you were experiencing on the job?
I think it was a hindsight. I don't think that I realized what it was that was happening until probably a couple years after I was already out. When I was in it, I was drowning. And so I couldn't really see clearly what was happening. Um, Until I was at that point where I was forced to make a decision, and I thought, "I'm too much of a liability at this point. I need to pivot and take another role." And after doing that, yeah, I would say it was a couple of years before I realized that it was burnout because I was able to start recovering from it. But then I also realized that old habits die hard. And when you have a nervous system that wants to be 400 miles an hour at all times,
Were you creating
um,
chaos?
yeah, I was working full time as a victim advocate. I went back to get my master's degree while I was planning a wedding. Also took on a 10-month yoga teacher training, started teaching yoga twice a week. Like I was just creating this massive schedule for myself for no reason. I could have
Just so
just
you can run at the
pri
speed you're used to. Yeah.
exactly, and so I think that moment where I realized, "Wow, why do I pile all this stuff on? I do this to myself." I started to recognize what was happening, and then I started to dive deeper into it and was like, "Okay, yeah, I burned out because I just went too hard, too fast for too long."
Yeah, it's interesting because once you're out of it for a little bit, you realize that you do have the freedom, choice, and agency to make different decisions. You can slow things down a bit and live a completely different life, but you're so hardwired for what is the next thing that you don't know what to do with yourself. And I think that's a very slippery slope because it's very easy to fall into a depression because of that, because you are so used to the next thing. When you don't have a next thing, where do you go and what do you do with yourself?
Yeah, and I think you're driven by external forces. You're literally being dispatched. You have somebody telling you
Right.
where you're going, where your next dopamine hit's coming
I
from,
was just going to say, yeah.
where your next adrenaline dump is coming from. And that I think a lot of people fall into feeling very comfortable in that on duty, and then they go home and they're very uncomfortable and they don't know how to handle it. And so they just continue to take on more overtime, take on more shifts, and that contributes to the burnout because they're not taking breaks. They're not getting a variety for their brain. They're not resting properly. And so it just keeps driving them further and further into the job and burnout.
Yeah, they're also not connecting with their loved ones in the way that is more meaningful for the entire family unit. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about stress and burnout in the first responder careers?
It's become far too normalized. So I think that a lot of people think that it's just part of the job. When you're 15 years in, of course, you're going to be exhausted and on your second divorce and have an alcohol problem and be $400,000 in debt. Of course, that's going to be the case. That does not, that's not part of the job.
Right.
Those are not things that should be normalized. I think sometimes when we think about burnout, we think about it as just the exhaustion. And although that is a major component, it's so much more than that because it's affecting our nervous system. It's affecting which in our nervous system affects everything that we do. It affects our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, actions, habits, relationships, the way we handle money, the way we just show up and interact with people. And in the research in my book, I researched a lot of different models of burnout. And the one that seemed to resonate the most with first responders was the Maslow burnout inventory. And they named three main components of burnout, and that's the exhaustion, cynicism, and then feeling like you're not making an impact or a difference anymore.
Yeah.
And so those are the three things. And I was like, that's for first responders for sure. That is the gold standard.
Oh,
And so that's what I dove into, but it's so much more than just the exhaustion.
yeah, you definitely get initiated into the cynicism. It's so interesting because it's part of the culture, it's part of the history. As you learn from the people that came before you, you learn from day shift and they show you all of the things that they're so upset about in the world. And then, of course, the younger people take that on and it's just a cycle that perpetuates itself for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years until at some point it stops. And hopefully, your book is going to be one of those things that allows people to train in on nervous system regulation, what that actually means, and we can start making a shift within the culture of policing.
Yeah, I certainly hope so.
What strategies have you found most effective for resetting the nervous system after prolonged stress?
First of all, you have to focus in on the body. When I left full-time law enforcement, I took about a month off, and I joke that I became Rumpelstiltskin because I involuntarily slept for 18 hours a day, every day for a month. My nervous system and my adrenals were completely shot, and I was very upset. I had a lot of things planned that I needed and wanted to do, and I was like,
Okay.
"This sucks." Making sure that you're supporting the body and the nervous system, it really just goes back to the basics. Sleep. Sleep is paramount. It is everything because if you are not sleeping, your brain is not working properly, your body is not working properly, you're not going to be able to recover. Um, and that's why sometimes we flex about going on so little sleep. Like, I only got 3 hours of sleep, but I'm here, I'm ready to rock. Like,
I got my
okay,
5 monsters. I'm good to go.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
not a flex. That is a liability.
Yeah.
And ask me how I know. And so sleep is number one. Number two, really watching your nutrition. And I know people like roll their eyes. They're like, oh my God, everybody says just eat the right foods and hydrate. Yes. Yes. Everybody says it because it's true,
Yeah.
because it's that important. The way that you fuel your body it's going to dictate what's coming out, but like as far as your thoughts and your emotions and your mental health and your ability to remain grounded in those things. Um, Hydrating, we don't think about the fact that when you are consistently and constantly stressed, you're dumping cortisol into your system. You have to be able to flush it out. Otherwise, it gets real cozy in your muscle fibers. And then we wonder why we feel like we just did 4 rounds with Rocky. Like it is important. And by the way, then when you have that muscle tension, that's telling your body that you're bracing for something.
Yeah.
And so then that just further perpetuates all those things, moving your body, getting sunlight, connecting with people. I know people, gross, but connecting with people, creating healthy, safe relationships in your life. It's hard. It's work, but we can't survive without other people. And I believe it was 2013, oh my gosh, 2023, where the Surgeon General put out a report that said loneliness or not having any kind of safe, healthy relationships is more detrimental to your physical health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and more detrimental to your physical health than drinking 6 alcoholic beverages a day.
I
Like
believe it.
we're hardwired to be around each other and to have these connections. And so when you don't have that, your mind just goes and creates all kinds of different stories. So resetting the nervous system 101 is controlling the basics, mastering the ordinary. It's not jumping to supplements and if you need medication, that's another topic, but it's not jumping to the fads. It's putting in the work, being consistent, moving your body and taking care of yourself. And then you can work on, let's unpack why and how you got here. And usually that requires some guidance from a professional.
Yeah. I like that you said mastering the ordinary, because that's really the first step in any type of personal development journey. That's really, I think, one of the things that people could focus on within the first responder community is just that personal development. So you tap into a little Andrew Huberman and let that inspire you a little bit, and you start to realize that, yeah, eating and exercise and hydration are super important, and there's things that you can do that can be of support to your body physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. When you tap into each of those areas and have a small habit and practice around that, you begin to take your power back from some of the things that you give it away to so freely, and you start to mitigate that potential for injury and problems. And you'll certainly mitigate excessive time off because you're taking care of yourself and you're putting yourself in that position where, you know what, surprise, I ran a couple miles and man, I feel pretty good. Now, we always come back to, I don't have time for that. Must be nice. I just worked a 16-hour shift. What am I supposed to do to get through that? And what would you tell the person that says those things?
It's non-negotiable. You have to make time for it. It's not about fitting it into your schedule. It's about fitting your schedule around taking care of yourself. Because if you can't take care of yourself, your ability to recover after each shift it shrinks. And so then you have longer recovery times. Next thing you know, you're burned out or you're having to take 3 months off just to get that recovery. You have got to take care of yourself. Find micro recovery ways on your shift if you're sitting in your car and it's 2 in the morning and you're like just waiting for the next car to drive by, get out and do 10 squats.
Yeah.
Get out and walk around the car a few times. Chug a bottle of water. Do a breathing exercise. Listen to something encouraging. What we feed our mind is also very important. And oftentimes in law enforcement, we just hear everybody else's crap all day long. That's why we go to the squad room and everything is just gossip and BS and negativity. And I don't want to be here. And oh,
Yeah,
this,
bitch, moan,
yeah,
whine, and complain. That's
yeah.
just
And
the way.
when you do that, there's 37 trillion cells in your body listening to the way you're speaking to yourself and others. And if it's not uplifting, there's no wonder you feel like you're under a boulder. So you have to be able to be mindful of that and just small, consistent things, just building it into your everyday life. Like I said, grabbing 10 squats or doing some jumping jacks and nobody wants to do those things. But if it's going to help you in the long run, your body will get used to it if you're consistent and your body will start to crave it. And so then it will just become easier. It'll just become normal. And then you'll be the weirdo doing jumping jacks in the parking lot. And everybody's looking at you like you're crazy. But guess what? You slept well that night.
Yeah, and you feel good.
Yeah.
And then they think you're like this anomaly. Oh, must be nice. Look at this person. Then they start picking your life apart on all the reasons why you can do this. And really what they're looking for is all the reasons why they can't.
But really, we should take those things. And that's where that cynicism comes back
Yeah.
in, is it's a psychological distancing. It's see something that we don't quite understand, or we don't believe in ourselves enough. We don't think that we're able to attain it. We're going to put distance between ourselves and that thing and say, that thing's bad. I can't attain that. So I never wanted it anyway. We're lying to ourselves. And I talk a lot about mastering the ordinary because in these jobs, we tend to go for the extraordinary right away, right? We want leadership. We want to be brave. We want to be courageous. We want to save people's lives. And that's the extraordinary. And we do those things. But if you have not mastered just the simplest taking care of yourself or learning how to be kind or hold space and have compassion for other people, all of that extraordinary turns into just extra. And then we start operating out of ego and we start focusing on, I want to look good so I don't look bad. I want to win so I don't lose. I want to be better than the next guy. And that's all counterfeit happiness. That's not real. You're not getting any joy out of that. You might get a dopamine hit, but it's not sustaining you. And so making sure that it's really honestly what it boils down to is just living a wholesome life.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's so interesting when you really think about it. If you can be the person that creates enough capacity and empathy for others, meaning you have to stretch yourself to the greatest degree on the inside with your nervous system to be able to handle the discomfort and the uncertainty that you're experiencing in this moment. But you've been here before, you've seen it, you've done it 100 times already, and you don't need to be a level 100 when you know that you can enter in at a level 10 and just allow for that to be there, allow for it to exist, and then manage the situation appropriately. Instead of going to that level 100 as soon as you hit the door, it's a completely different experience when you show up to certain types of calls. And obviously, use your discernment and what you need to do in the moment. But if you can do that on these particular calls that require that extra empathy, you can mitigate a lot of problems, believe it or not.
That just reminded me of, and I don't write about this specific instance in the book, but I write about this person. And I had a lieutenant that and we had a frequent flyer and she was always scrappy.
Yeah.
And she had put her car in the ditch and I was trying to get her into the cruiser, right? I was assisting her and she started kicking me and spitting at me and all these things. And I got very angry and I was assisting her to the ground, but I was yelling at her. And
Mhm.
I will never forget being on the ground with her. I got her in cuffs and I got her on the ground and I look up and he's just leisurely walking over, just slow as can be, no reaction on his face. And I'm like, what's
Good.
wrong with this guy? Like, he was just so calm.
Yeah.
And it almost made me upset because I was like, did you not just see that? And he just walked over and grabbed her other arm and we picked her up and we put her in the cruiser. And I was like, what the heck is wrong with this guy? And I came to realize, because he was a man of few words, but I came to realize that he just did not allow himself to be hijacked by situations if it wasn't absolutely necessary. And in hindsight, I'm going to get emotional. In hindsight, that's the way I want to live my life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's everybody has a threshold. And so again, you want to expand that capacity and that threshold and tolerance for that uncertainty, for that discomfort. If you've ever encountered Dr. Mitch Javidi, he talks about this as anti-fragility. So you're creating that threshold within yourself to be able to handle different pressure situations and high intensity situations, knowing that this is going to come because that's the job that you signed up to do. So this isn't something that's new or different. You've experienced this before, you know how to navigate this. But if we're not taking care of ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, then you're going to find that your threshold is extremely low. And when it's extremely low, you put yourself and others in danger.
Yeah. And I think that there are times where people confuse that bold, maybe not bold, but they confuse the aggression with strength,
Yeah.
and it actually makes you look like a toddler. And that was where I was at that point. That was my emotional intelligence in that moment. But now, having had 2 children and one of them being a toddler right now, that's pretty much what it looks like.
Yeah. Your new book sheds light on mental health struggles of first responders. What was the driving force behind writing it? And what do you hope that readers take away from
The driving force partially was because I accidentally created like a medium-sized TikTok account, and I was constantly getting like questions and people wanting just small bits of information, not necessarily wanting my full coaching package or anything like that, but they're just like, "Hey,
it?
can I run this past you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but I got like 50 of those today. It's gonna take
Right.
a minute." But I've been doing this almost 4 years now, and I just have so many people who were so curious about my story and the different angles that I approach things, because some of it's through the ethical practices of yoga and just different modalities. And they want to know like how I did it. And I think that's great. But the way I got better isn't necessarily the way somebody else is going to get better. Obviously, there's no blueprint.
Exactly.
We have to create our own.
Nicely done.
And well, but it's true. Everybody has to walk their own path.
Yeah.
And we can certainly guide people and ask the right questions and all of that. But anyhow, it came out of that, a lot of requests for just little tidbits of information. But I have always felt somewhere deep inside of me that I wanted to write a book and use it to infuse some of the things that I have learned in my life. I've always been a deep thinker. And so the book really takes you from being in a space of not having a whole lot of clarity, not having the capacity to think deeply. So going from the basics to really exploring things that only our hearts can see. And that's where I want to bring people to. That's how I want to help people expand and get back to being who they once were, or maybe not even who they once were, but who they desire to be.
Yeah.
Because the way we show up in this world is not necessarily based on any kind of accomplishments or rank or title or anything like that. It's who we are as a person, our character, and how we mostly, my biggest barometer is how you treat people. And I think if we can get back to being able to connect with ourselves, then we can connect with others. And that's how we're going to actually start supporting each other and raise everybody up out of this dumpster fire that we've been in.
Yeah, it's interesting when we start talking about the different modalities that are available to help people with nervous system regulation. I think people need to recognize that we weren't all trained, our nervous systems weren't trained on the same model because we
Mm.
all had different caregivers who had different experiences. And you had an experience of them. And then your nervous system is written based off of their responses to you as a toddler. And then that's what you experience as part of your own capacity and threshold for that uncertainty and the attachment and detachment that you experience. So now as an adult, you're in this place and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? So you start reading some of these books and you dive into it and you're trying to figure these things out. And the journey of self-discovery is unique to you as an individual. So you have to be willing to read a book, and maybe you're not interested in the book. You get halfway through. So what? Go all the way through, take what you can learn from it, force yourself to make a promise to yourself and keep it. And in that keeping that promise to yourself, you're training yourself and telling yourself that you're worthy of this transition, this journey of self-discovery to figure yourself out and become who you're capable of becoming, which is everybody's purpose on this planet. If you didn't know, you have to become who you're capable of becoming. And the way to do that is through self-education.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it takes work, and it
Yeah.
takes keeping that commitment to yourself, that self-discipline. That's the greatest form of self-love. And I think sometimes we, you know, if I can be frank, we've gotten really soft on ourselves. We've gotten really, there's a lot of excuses and a lot of distractions, but those distractions are destroying the actions that you're trying to take. And so we have to be able to stay focused. Stop doing the little things that just give you the quick little dopamine hit, and do the things that are going to give you that major dopamine hit when you actually can fully embody yourself in an authentic way and be happy with who you are.
Yeah.
There is no greater high than that. There is no greater freedom than being able to say, I like myself. And when you've been in a place where that wasn't the case for whatever length of time, that is the greatest gift you can give yourself.
I agree. You gotta like yourself. There's no doubt about that. While writing your book and reflecting on personal experiences can be intense, were there any unexpected realizations or challenges during the writing process that changed the way you see your past?
Yeah. Writing a book and being as detailed as you have to be can be very intense. And so I actually hired a book writing coach, Adam Davis. He works mostly with first responders. He's a former first responder himself, and he's written several books. I had a lot of content already for the lessons, the portions that were the teachable moments, but I had to drum up my stories. Like I had the stories, but I had to actually put them into something meaningful and sustainable. And that was a process because there were times where I would just throw something in and he's, okay, what did that feel like? Bring the reader in. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I had to go in and put my experience into it and then infuse kind of everything that I was going through in that moment into the writing, which stretched my abilities. And I think I'm a much better writer now for it. But looking at everything in my past, it's very clear to me that all of it happened for a reason. And in the moments where you can't see the reason, you can't see that far, can't see that far out into the horizon, it can be very hard. But now looking back, I'm like, okay, I wouldn't have been able to teach this person this piece if I had never gone through this thing, or I would never have been able to understand or help somebody else understand this moment in their life if I hadn't gone through this thing. So every single thing that I experienced had a purpose. And now applying that to real time, when things happen and a big wave is coming my way, I can go, okay, this has a meaning. This has a purpose. I will use this in some way to make this meaningful and purposeful in my future. Doesn't mean it's not gonna suck, but it's going to be worth something. It's going to be valuable in some way. And that, I think, has been a major game changer for me moving forward.
And I love all of that because it speaks to the pivot of leaving law enforcement and recognizing that's not the end of your life. I think that's really important because especially a few years ago, everybody was talking about transitioning out of law enforcement and what am I supposed to do? There were a lot of struggles. People were ready to retire or they were just leaving because they're early in their career and they didn't like the way things were going. But you're in this position, you've been doing it for years. It becomes a part of who you are, so much so that it's a part of your identity. Then you have to mourn and let go of that identity of this person that you knew yourself to become. That can be really difficult. After my shoulder surgery and neck injury and leaving policing, I slept like that year after, it just felt like all I did was sleep and couldn't figure out why. What is that all about? Am I depressed? What is happening? Because you don't expect it. You've been moving at such a high pace for so long, and then it cuts off, it slows down, and then you start thinking, okay, what's next? What am I capable of doing? And so for anybody that's listening to this, recognize that you have valuable skills that you learned and earned over your time in policing that will transition wonderfully into the corporate world or to owning your own business. It's really the world is your oyster at that point because you have all of these skills that you can utilize to do whatever you want to do with. So it's if you have a dream, you can make it happen. I took my skills and abilities and transitioned that into being a content creator. And now I have over 500,000 followers and growing and a top 2% podcast. I don't say that to brag. I say that to say that if you do anything long enough and consistently enough over long periods of time with discipline, you will receive a result. Now, is it the result that you want? Not necessarily. There's always room to grow and change and develop and evolve, and you have to learn and you have to self-educate. This is a whole process. It's all new. I didn't do videography or content creation prior to this. Like these are all skills that you have to take on and learn. But throughout your entire career, you spent all that time and all the different coursework and classes, getting all the different certifications. And this is no different. So you're just taking that same skill set, applying it to something new, and then being dedicated to seeing it become successful.
Yeah, and I think that's where you have to really break through that cynicism
Yes.
and start to have hope. God
100%.
forbid, right? Like we have to be able to hope that things are going to work out and that you are capable of becoming the person that you want to be and believing in yourself. And I think that there's in this culture a little bit of we honor the sense of humility and self-sacrifice and service and all of these things and all those things are great, but you also have to believe in yourself. You also have to support yourself and have hope that life can be great. We see ev most of the time, we see people on their worst day, and
Yeah.
so we get this confirmation bias, that's what life is, and it doesn't have to be that way. We also, I think, get a sense of guilt when we do experience joy because we know that somebody out there right now is experiencing the worst day of their life. We're keenly aware of that. But just because there somebody out there right now is experiencing that doesn't mean that we're not allowed to experience joy. It doesn't mean that we're not allowed to be happy because at some point those people had joyful and happy days too, and they will probably again.
How do we build and cultivate hope within ourselves when we feel hopeless?
Well, the best way that I know how to do it is through my faith.
Yeah.
But I think it's little by little proving to yourself, training your brain to look for the good things, holding gratitude. There's this practice, and I don't know where it originated from, but it's called like the thank you practice or something like
Mhm.
that. You probably know about it,
Are
where
you
you
talking
just
about Ho'oponopono?
no, that's the maybe. No, that's the meditation one.
Yeah.
But it's you just walk around and say thank you to everything. Hey, thank you, hands, for working today so
Yeah.
that I could brush my teeth, or thank you, teeth, for chewing my food for me. And it sounds so silly. Thank you, phone, for connecting me with people that I love, or thank you. But when you do that, you're training your brain to hold gratitude. You're training your brain to see the good things and the value in life in even the small things. And I think that can shift your perspective to be able to see better things in the future.
What you're also doing in that moment is you're practicing presence. And in practicing that presence is also regulation. We do all these things in tandem, right? So it's like you're practicing presence, You're giving yourself some nervous system regulation, and you're probably going to add some breath work to that. Thank you for this. It doesn't have to be something complicated, right? It's just a deep breath in and a long exhale out. You let that go and your shoulders drop. You begin to relax. Your heart rate slows and you start to feel good about where you're at in this moment. You stop focusing on the future and you detach from the outcome of the future. You recognize that you have a sight picture, a target in the future that you're trying to get, but you also recognize that right now is the only time that you're ever going to have on the planet, and that you have to do the work in this moment if you ever expect to attain that thing in the future. So you allow yourself in the future, you're in the present moment, you're thinking about the future, visualizing what it feels like to be the person that's in the future in the present moment. And then you do the work to move forward and push yourself forward so that you can get to that place. And when you start to do that, you begin to realize that everything that you think is possible for yourself really is, but it's a slow moving process. It doesn't happen in 6 months. I know everybody wants a time period. Is it 2 weeks? Is it 30 days? Is it a year? No, like when we talk about healing, especially, it takes as long as it takes. And it's going to be, I don't want to say that it's equal to, but it's going to be close to equal to the amount of effort that you're putting into whatever it is that you're working on in the moment. The other part of this is other things are going to pop up over long periods of time. So we always think, oh, I'm healed. You are healed, right? And that's not the way it works. It's 10 years later, this thing's going to pop up because you had a sight, a sound, a smell, an activity, something happened, a situation, a person, whatever, something pops up and you're right back where you were 10 years ago. And you're like, what happened? And this is why we talk about nervous system capacity, because healing, what it really is at the end of the day, is creating that capacity within yourself to deal with the stress or the uncertainty or discomfort of a particular moment, a particular experience. So over time, what you realize, and you're in that future moment, is that you spend less time in an activated state than you did in the past. So it might have taken you days to weeks prior to get over this particular triggering. And now in the future, it takes maybe an hour, right? Or less, depending on the work that you've done. So just recognize that healing is not a linear path, and it's certainly not easy, but boy, is it necessary to live the type of life that you want to have.
Yeah, because as you go on, you shed more and more of the backlog, right? You release all the things that you've been carrying around, which gives you a greater capacity to handle the things in the future.
I love that you've transitioned into public speaking and training for law enforcement. How have first responders responded to these conversations around mental health? And do you see the culture shifting?
I do see the culture shifting.
Good.
I can say by and large, I get mostly a mix of, wow, that was great. Thank you so much. This stuff really needs to be talked about. I had no idea that the body was that intertwined with our mental health and things like that. People just don't know. And when we start to learn these things, then it becomes obvious to us. And we have to remember that not everybody knows this stuff yet. By and large, it's a really great response. I get a lot of people wanting more. They've been wanting this kind of training for a long time, and they're they're very grateful for it. And then I get a lot of people who come in because they were voluntold to be there, and they actually because I get the surveys afterwards, and they're like, "This was really eye-opening. Thank you so much. I had no idea." There are still some, we'll call them crusties, because there are still some that are just in this old mindset, operating out of ego and just not open to it. And there's going to be some people like that. I had one sergeant actually who was very vocal about, he stopped me in the middle of my 4-hour presentation. I was about 2.5 hours in, and he said, "You guys know this is all bullshit." And I was like, "Okay, we're gonna have fun with this." And I made mention, we had a little moment of, okay, I hear you, but let's not ruin it for everybody else that might actually be learning something. And then I had a little moment towards the end where I said that people often are very defensive when they hear things that hit deeply. So we have to remember that, not everybody is ready for healing. And I swept it out,
Yeah.
cleaned it up afterwards.
The
But
1990s called, they want your attitude back.
yeah. So you're gonna get people like that. And I think if for anybody who is doing training of this sort or wanting to be in peer support or do anything like this, just know that's going to happen. But you have to recognize that they're not coming from a place of readiness.
Yeah.
And I think the chief actually talked to me after that. He wasn't in the room when that happened, or that probably would have been handled a lot differently. But he said, what do I do for this guy? This is toxic, yeah?" And I was like, "Yeah, for one." And I said, "Honestly, he's from what I can see, a cancer to the department, but deep down, he really just needs a big hug."
Oh yeah.
He's coming from a place of deep-seated pain that he's not been able to reconcile with or even be willing to face. And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "People don't act like that if they're doing great." And I think that's something to remember too, is to hold compassion for
But you
those
can always
people.
tell.
But
I'm sure that guy's face was bright red, nose was probably a little purple. But it's just you can always read it on the person's body about where they're at, what they need, what's going on inside of them. Like you're not hiding anything. What I think about is interesting about these trainings is a lot of times they'll go out on break and they'll be talking to each other and you'll hear the information's interesting. I just wish I understood it better. Sometimes it's just a lack of understanding, or like you said, that readiness to receive the information. It's not that you're not conveying it in a way that isn't easy to understand. It's just I'm locked in. I'm not prepared to hear this because it means I have to admit some things about myself. And I'm just not ready to feel those feelings or to acknowledge those parts of me that have gone unacknowledged for so long. And are they a cancer on the environment? Potentially, depending on how they operate within that environment, within the agency. But if the majority of officers are connecting with this material and they're starting to use it, that tends to take over the culture more than the sassy old timers that are just looking to retire.
yeah, and that's where I'm seeing the change is the people who are coming in, the rookies, this is more normal to them,
Yeah.
right? Like they're more tapped in, they're more tuned in, and so they're more willing to receive. And I think that 15 years from now, and if we looked to 10 years ago, we've come leaps and bounds, but this is a marathon. This is not, we're not going to change it in 5 years. It's going to be another at least 15 years before we start to see the full takeover of recognizing trauma, recognizing people in active burnout, and then actually giving them the time to recover or supporting them in the measures to recover. But one of the things I hear the most feedback wise is that I'm able to make it very consumable and make it very easy for people to understand what it is. And I think that's just a testament to the fact that I've been there. And so I think that's really important when we bring people into our agencies, is that the person is not, and nothing against psychologists and counselors and people in the clinical world, but it lands differently when the person has been there.
Yeah. I think it's also important for the new people to recognize that you can't meet threats with a hug. And so you have to use your discernment because they will bowl you over if you're not prepared to deal with a threat appropriately. I've recognized and I've found early on that a lot of people were struggling with the way some policing happens, but it's necessary again to the threat level. And
Yes.
it can be hard to make that connection sometimes. And then they start to feel bad about themselves because, oh, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. And it's no, you're not doing anything wrong. This is actually appropriate to the level of interaction that you're having with the particular person in time.
Yeah.
Now,
We
what you do
can't.
with that information, that's now on you to then deal with.
Yeah. But we can't gentle parent society. It's not how it
No.
works.
You created a one-on-one coaching program for first responders. What is at the core of that training?
The framework that I follow is the combat method, which I came up with. And it's the first step is to connect with yourself and learn how to connect the dots on how we got here, right? So connection, because connection is important for so many other reasons, because even if we can't be that regulated person all the time, as long as we're connected enough to recognize that we're not regulated, then we can bring ourselves into regulation. So staying connected. The next step is to offload and learn how to release some of that old baggage, release old habits, and also set healthy boundaries so that we don't just backfill that. Ask me how I know. Because we have to be able to give ourselves the time and space to heal and give ourselves room to breathe, give our nervous system room to breathe. So, offloading. The next step is to mobilize because I'm a nerd, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs says that once we start to feel some relief, we will back off of the new habits, hence why most New Year's resolutions only last a couple of weeks. So that is when we actually start to mobilize and start to create sustainable systems to maintain that self-discipline and the new habits. Then we work on building. That's the B in the combat method. And we start to focus on identity and who you are outside of that uniform, who you are outside of the roles that you carry, even in your personal life as a wife, a husband, mom, dad, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, whatever it is. And it's just who you are at your core, your true essence, your identity. The next step is to align all of those things and start to live your life and really embody that and seeing yourself, envisioning yourself as that new person, that 2.0. And then it's to transition. So I wouldn't be a great coach if I kept you under my wing all of the time. So the next step is to learn how to coach yourself, transition into holding your feet to the fire without judgment. So just maintaining that level of consistency without shaming yourself when you fall off the wagon. So that is the combat method. Those are the pillars. We focus on a lot of different things. It's mostly client led based on what their needs are, but I have the framework to get them the results that they want. And usually those results that I'm seeing is that people are able to engage with their family much more. They're able to be in the present moment. They're able to recognize in the moment when they're being hijacked and overcome by a wave of emotion, and they can slow down and breathe and regulate and come back to center. They're feeling better. They're out from under that blanket of exhaustion. And a lot of my clients are seeing long-term success. I have one that was already fairly highly ranked in a state agency. And after a couple of years, she was very burned out. And a couple years later, she's now received 2 promotions and is even higher in this state agency and really being valued for not only her contributions to the agency, but for her character and her leadership and her ability to connect with people and guide people. Whereas before, there were a lot of issues there because she just didn't have the capacity to deal with people. And it's really great to see successes in all of my clients.
Absolutely. And that was the next question. So I'm really glad that you shifted into a success story on that.
Yeah.
If you could change one systemic issue in how law enforcement and first responder agencies handle mental health, what would it be?
I don't know if it can be mandated or put into policy, but what we really need is better connection from leadership, better checking in on your people and not necessarily just throwing out a policy because like you said, it goes in the SOP. You might look over it once, maybe, and then it goes up on a shelf. I don't know that policies are going to change a whole lot. I think what we really need is people to actually care and take action and start to look each other in the eyes and have a real conversation and check in on people. I think that's where the change is going to happen. I'm seeing more and more of that as more and more people become trained in peer support and just go to a training for wellness and they start to realize how important it really is. I'm seeing more of that. Um, I don't know that policies are going to change a whole lot. I would love to see a clinician available to every department. I know every department doesn't necessarily need an in-house clinician, but having somebody available, I think would be incredibly important. I think yearly assessments are great, but also we know what to say. If we're not
Oh,
good, we know how to fake our way through it. And I don't know that's going to change a whole lot. I think the culture, the little nuances, the day to day is what's going to actually impact change.
AK, thank you for an amazing 100th episode of the Blueprint Podcast. Tell everybody how they can find you, work with you, and get your book.
Thank you very much for having me. The best place to find me is just akdozanti.com. Everything is linked up there, including the book. Little sneak peek.
I've got mine on order. It's coming.
Yes, Beat the Burnout, Prevention and Recovery Solutions for Frontline Professionals. All of my socials are linked up on akdozanti.com, and that's a wrap.